we see that Abraham's faith is prevalent at this point. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 11 and get a glimpse as to what Abraham might have been thinking. 11 verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested up, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was to him who was said, "As Isaac your descendant shall be called." He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he has also received him back as a type. So we see there that Abraham is thinking, God's asking me to sacrifice my only son, but he's also told me his descendants are going to be too numerous to count, so that he's thinking God's going to raise him from the dead. I serve a God that has power over death. So as Abraham is raising his hand to slay his son, he hears the call. He's heard his voice before. Abraham, Abraham. At that moment, Abraham discovers God's provision. Abraham, do not harm a lad. I see your faith in me. You didn't withhold your son, your only son, from me. Abraham sees the ram caught in the thicket and knows that God has provided the sacrifice. So trust God to provide for your journey. Abraham worships there in that place on the mountain and calls it Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. Are we trusting God to provide? Let me share a couple of lines from a poem by Lowndes called God's Provision. We so often do not trust in God. We lack faith that He will provide. We worry, we fret, and we fuss so much. In His blessings we do not abide. For how can the hand of Almighty God stretch forth with all that we need if we are not even expecting it and have doubt instead of belief? We must believe in God's provision as sure as the fresh morning dew, for He already knows just what our needs, and He will always come through. I recently had an abnormal mammogram. My best friend from college has just been ending her battle with breast cancer. She had multiple chemotherapies, radiation treatment, surgeries. My abnormal mammogram could have easily caused me to just fall apart. So the next step in my journey was an ultrasound that showed I have a mass. They scheduled me for a biopsy, and all the testing took about a week's time before I was supposed to hear any results. Your mind can go to some really dark places when you're facing a trial like that in your life. I kept praying and trusting for God, trying to understand. And I knew that this didn't take Him by surprise. He already knew what was going to happen, just like He did with Abraham. He had already made provisions, and that gives me a lot of comfort and faith when I'm traveling a road that is uncertain. After the biopsy, they said I would hear something, and waiting for that test result can get long. I kept trusting God to give me strength, and of course it was several days before they called me. And God gave me a serene peace, and I even had sympathy or empathy for the lady that has the job to make those phone calls, because she's not always giving good news to people. It turns out that particular biopsy for me was benign, but I also learned that that's not the only mass that I have, so I may have more biopsies in my future. So my journey hasn't ended necessarily, but we'll still continue to trust God's provision and His sovereignty. Many times our journeys don't go the way that we want them to, or end when we want them to end, or where we want them to end, but we must trust God to provide every step of the way in our journey. He will not leave us or forsake us. He will not necessarily provide what we want, but in the manner that He sees best. Trusting God can also, and His provisions can also lead to blessings. We'll see how Abraham's journey's ending. Let's look at Genesis 22:15 here at the end of the story. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you. I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars in the heavens, as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of the enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So Abraham returned to these young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived there at Beersheba. So God's promises great blessings for Abraham, because of his tremendous faith and obedience. He promises that his seed will be as plentiful as the stars in the sky and the sand on the shore. Abraham's journey back down the mountain with Isaac had to be joyous and victorious. He had to feel just this peace. He already had been, his obedience had been rewarded by God. God's always faithful to his promises. God desires for us to seek him. He wants fellowship with us. His provision, his blessing, his outcome may often be very different than what we're seeking, but we continue to trust because he loves us. He loves us enough that he gave his only son, his promised Messiah, seed of Abraham and Isaac, to be the sacrifice for our sin. He wants us to follow him. John 15:14, Jesus tells us that we're his friends when we do what he commands. So we need to trust and obey to deepen our relationship with him. So after 15 years in a career that I loved with my former company, I lost that job due to downsizing in the healthcare industry after the Affordable Care Act passed. I felt betrayed, a little bit angry, somewhat devastated, and began to pray and was determined to give those emotions and the situation over to God. I began to seek God, trusting that he had a plan larger than I could see. Other than taking time off when my kids were born, I had worked at that job for 15 years. I had worked since I was 15 years old and never had a day that I didn't get up and have somewhere to have to go. So I had to kind of make a plan for myself. I started a daily plan of time and devotion with the Lord every morning, then exercise, and then the job search. The job search was an eye-opening experience. Medical sales reps had become very specialized, and it was a lot harder to find the next career than I thought it was going to be. So I did have a severance package, which afforded me the opportunity to look for the right job, but also spend valuable time with my daughter, her senior year of high school. So I got to go to every golf match and basketball game and soccer game while day after day looking for that next job. As my daughter was getting closer to graduation, it was becoming evident that God was leading not only her, but our son as well, to Johnson University in Knoxville. They both learned about Johnson by attending a youth retreat at Pigeon Forge, and with another kid on the trip that was making a college visit to Johnson. So after seeing that both of them were headed to Knoxville, my husband suggested that I started looking in Knoxville for my next job opportunity. And I'm like, really? We just built this house a few years ago. We were supposed to be our final home. I've never even been to East Tennessee. But I did. I added Knoxville to my daily job search, and as I networked with colleagues, I was on the phone one day with manager and mentioned to him that I was possibly looking at East Tennessee for my next opportunity, and he sounded a bit surprised, but said they may have an opening there in the future. Was God opening that door for me in this area that I had never been to? Is he taking me on a different journey? The opportunity came, and it was the job that I really wanted, selling a product I wanted to sell. So we were all going to be headed to East Tennessee. I accepted the job and went only 1 week without pay when my severance ended and that one began. God was providing. Little did I know at the time that God would also bring me back to school at Johnson myself in their online program to complete a degree. I sought God at a time of despair in my life, and he provided. He provided for my journey every step of the way. The journey's not over, though. We're still trying to sell the house in North Carolina, and my husband and I, who've been married for 27 years, are basically living in 2 different states right now. But we're trusting God that he has a buyer for that house. He has a plan. We learned from Abraham that God is Jehovah Jireh. He will provide for those journeys in life. Whenever struggle, doubt, worry, conflict is present in your life, remember God has a provision available, just like he did for Abraham. Abraham's view was only of one side of the mountain. God had the big view from the top of the mountain. He could see both sides, and he knew the ram was available, even though Abraham couldn't see it at the time. Sometimes God's provision for us is not what we envisioned, but we trust that God has a bigger picture and plan for our life. He is sovereign. Trust God to provide for your needs. Are you facing a trial, an unplanned journey in your life, a need that you need to give to God? A physical issue, a marital problem, a financial need, a difficult parenting situation, an uncertain or unknown plan. Maybe you need to give it to God and trust Him to provide for your journey.